Hey everyone, it's Paul. Are you new to sculpting? Is this something that you wanted to pick up and try, but you're not sure where to start? Well, I'm here to give you some tips and tricks on how to get started with sculpting in polymer clay. Let's get started. So the one question that I get asked a lot is, hey Paul, what tools do I need to use to get started sculpting? And honestly, the one tool that you need, you already have. It's these, your hands. Most of the work that you're going to be doing with clay, you're going to be using these. You're going to be conditioning the clay, you're going to be rolling balls with the clay, you're going to be smoothing the clay. All of that is done with these. You don't need to buy anything, you come pre-equipped. But once you get into the detail work of your sculpture, once you want to start adding smaller details or finessing the clay, that's when you're going to get into some hand tools. Everybody has a preference as to which tools are the right tools for them. I have some that I really recommend, but honestly, you're going to find that the tools that you use are the ones that are the best for you. But here, I'll show you the ones that I like to use and why I like to use them. So these are the three tools that I personally use on every single project. The first one is this one here. It is a standard sculpting tool. This one happens to be a dental version of it, which is just a more high-end version. It has a knife on one side and a scoop on the other. The knife is made simply for scoring or for texturizing. The scoop is made for smoothing or for drilling. It is my favorite tool. I use it the most. The other tool that I use is this one here, which is a pokey stick with a curved side. This one happens to be aluminum, but what it is used primarily for is smoothing. If you notice, I don't hold it like a pencil. I hold it on its side and I roll the tool to help to smooth it out. The other end is used for getting into hard to reach areas if I need to smooth it or for creating indentations in hard to reach areas. The third tool that I like to use is this. This is a rake. A rake is basically a tube with smaller wires coming off the end of it. This one happens to be made out of spring steel, and it is made for smoothing out large areas or creating textures. So we can smooth it out by cross-hatching over an area. And then once that's done, it's moving clay into the lower areas and taking it from the higher areas so that we can smooth out the area of the clay that we want. As we remove the extra clay that's been built off the top of it, you can see that we have started to smooth this or homogenize it. The other thing that you can use it for is texture. I use this a lot for grass or hair or anything else that requires a little bit of texture. You can tap with it, you can pull with it, you can create waves with it. It's pretty much a universal tool for creating texture or for smoothing things out. And there you have it. Those are the three tools that I personally use on every single project. So you finished your sculpture and you're ready to bake it so that it lasts forever. What's the best process here? Well, you're going to use something like a baking sheet to put it into the oven, but I highly recommend a barrier between the baking sheet and the object you're baking so that the ambient heat coming from the bottom of the oven doesn't scorch the underside of your sculpture. I personally use a silicone mat. You can get them for sculptures, you can get them for cookies. It doesn't really matter. A silicone mat is a silicone mat. If you have an irregularly shaped object, you're going to need to create something that has little nests or pillows that will help support it inside the oven. And for that, I would recommend polyfill or a polyester fiber. You can buy that at any craft store and it is used for filling pillows. It is ideal because it is made to withstand heat at the temperatures that are required for baking polymer clay. If you have an oven like a toaster oven where the heating element is above the object, you're going to need to do something called tenting. That is done using aluminum foil where you create a barrier or a tent around the object. You don't want the aluminum to touch the thing that you're baking because it will scorch it. You need to create an air pocket around it so that the heating element heats the aluminum and then the aluminum heats the ambient air inside of it to the ideal temperatures to bake polymer clay. So what is the ideal temperature and time needed to bake polymer clay so that it will last forever? Well, the answer is written right here on the packaging. It's 275 degrees Fahrenheit or 130 degrees Celsius. That's what the clay needs to get to for 15 minutes for every quarter inch of thickness to create perfect polyamide chains. That's the chemical reaction that's happening inside polymer clay that allows it to be strong and last forever. The thing is people's ovens are not ideal. And so what I recommend is two things. One, get an oven thermometer. They're cheap. You just put them inside your oven and it tells you exactly how hot the inside of your oven actually is. You'll notice that your thermostat will say one thing, but the little thermometer will tell you something completely different. Now, the other thing that I recommend is actually baking it at a lower temperature than what's recommended here on the packaging. I recommend 265 degrees Fahrenheit or 125 degrees C. And the reason is kind of scientific, but what it comes down to is that your oven does actually get up to 275 degrees when you're baking at 265. That's because your heating element actually gets hot and the temperature raises before it comes back down once the thermostat turns it off. So cooking at 265 degrees is going to ensure that it does not scorch. Unfortunately, PVC has a low scorch point. It's like 283 degrees. And so you want to make sure that your clay doesn't ever get to that point because it can be toxic inside your oven. So what I recommend is 265 degrees Fahrenheit or 125 degrees Celsius for double the time. Now, you may be concerned about doubling the amount of time that the clay is inside the oven because you're afraid it's going to burn. That's the great thing about polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, the stuff that makes up this kind of clay, is that once it fully cures, once it creates those polyamide chains, it's done. It's inert. It's done. The only thing that can happen to it is it can be hot. All right, so as long as it doesn't burn or scorch, you're going to be okay. You can bake it for as long as you want. That's why there's something called multi-bake technique, in which people will bake it, take it out, add more, bake it again. It's because they're keeping it at a temperature that's not allowing it to scorch, and then therefore you're able to keep baking it over and over again, but they're baking it at a slightly lower temperature for a longer period of time. So your piece is sculpted, it's baked, but it needs a little bit of color, a little bit of zhuzh. So what are the best techniques for painting a finished baked sculpture using polymer clay? Well, here, let me show you. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, do I need to prime the sculpture before I paint it? And the answer is no, you don't. Polymer clay, when it's cured, has enough tooth that it is ideal for painting with acrylic paints. And what is tooth? It's texture. So when a clay is completely cured, it's got a little bit of texture and it holds the paint really well. Can you prime it? Absolutely, and it doesn't hurt it to do it. And people will prime it for a couple different reasons. One is to create a uniform look to the sculpture before painting it so they know where things are and how it looks, or two, because of the environment that the object is going to be in once it is done being painted, be it outside or underwater or whatever. Now, I recommend if you are going to prime it that you use something like a universal bonding primer, either airbrushed or rattle can, it doesn't really matter, but I recommend something that is made for all materials, not just plastic or wood, but one that can be used universally. Rust-Oleum makes a good version of it. Kryolan also has some nice ones. I've also got some that are made from all-clad and such. It really doesn't matter. As far as the paints go, acrylic paint is the way to go with polymer clay. What acrylic paints? Any of them. Cheap ones, expensive ones, it doesn't really matter. Acrylic paint works really well with polymer clay. I personally just like to buy the cheaper ones because it's got a wider array of colors. They're inexpensive. I can have a lot of them on hand. The only thing that I've noticed with them is that they can have a shorter shelf life. They kind of clump up inside the bottles a little bit quicker. But that's okay because I'm going to use the colors quickly, and then, if I have to throw them away, it's really inexpensive. So any of these will work really, really well. Now, the higher end ones are a nice paint as well. The thing is they usually have a higher pigment quality, and so they have a better flow. And flow is when you're putting the paint onto the piece and you're moving it across with the brush. If it moves really easily, it's got a good flow. If it kind of starts and stops, then it doesn't. If you're using the cheaper paints, adding a little bit of water to the paint will help the flow. You'll just need to do a couple more layers. Now, as far as brushes go, any brush will do. Whatever brush you're comfortable with. Cheap ones, expensive ones. The more expensive they are, the easier they are to use. You just need to know that they're made for acrylic or for a watercolor, and they work really nicely. Now, if I'm going to coat a large surface like this throne here, I'm going to use a wider brush, probably even wider than this. But if I'm going to come in and do detail work, I'm going to use a nice little detail brush like this one. But honestly, any brushes will work with polymer clay, just as long as it is made for acrylic paint or for watercolor. Now, can you use watercolor on polymer clay? Absolutely. You can even use oil paints on polymer clay. The thing that you need to know though is that oil-based paints will have an issue if you don't create a barrier between the polymer clay or the acrylic paint on top of the polymer clay and the oil paints. They won't dry. And so you need to put a barrier in there. Usually people use a medium, like a gloss medium or a matte medium in between it, just some kind of barrier, and then put the oil-based paint on top of that, and then it will cure. But if you're going to use oil-based paints, you need to do a top coat or a clear coat over the top of it. Do you need to clear coat all of your sculptures? No, not necessarily. This one here actually looks better being matte in tone. I could spray it with a matte paint, but then, you know, some of my gloss work that I've done here, some of the other colors are going to, you know, all become homogeneous in their looks. And so I want to leave this one as is. It's not going to be handled a lot either, so I'm not worried about the paint rubbing off. But if I've got a piece like this one here, which is going to be handled a lot, I want to make sure that there is a barrier on here to keep the paint from being buffed off of it. And if I'm going to do that, I'm going to use something like this clear acrylic. I personally really like this Treehouse Studio one because I know it doesn't react to the polymer clay. This is only available at Hobby Lobby though, so if you can't get this brand, it's not going to work for you. One word of caution with clear coats is to test it on your polymer clay, and typically not the piece that you're painting. You want to use a scrap or a throwaway. That is because I found that a lot of the clear coats will have cure inhibition. It will remain tacky over time. And so what you need to do is test a piece, fully bake it, and then spray it with either a clear coat or even your primer to see if it does cure. If it remains tacky after a few hours, that paint is not going to work for you. That clear coat is not going to work. You need to coat it with something else. So toss that piece away and find a different one that works for you. So there you have it. Painting polymer clay is just as easy as grabbing whatever paint you've got lying around and giving it a go. And then priming it or not priming it, or clear coat or not clear coat, it doesn't really matter. It's just your own personal preference and the look that you're going for with your piece. All right, so you're moving on from simple sculptures to things that are a little bit more complex. Maybe you want to tackle the human form where you've got arms akimbo, or you want something that's got a weapon or wings on a dragon. You're going to need to move into something called armatures. That is basically a skeleton inside that is rigid that will allow the clay to hang on to something during its baking phase so that it won't just all fall apart inside the oven. So here's a few tips and tricks on the best way to approach armatures. When you get into more complicated sculptures like these, you need an internal support that will help to hold the clay in place when you are baking it or sculpting it, and that is the armature. There are a couple different ways to approach armatures. Some people use large balls of aluminum foil. Some people will, like me, use wires. One of the wires that I use personally on a lot of smaller sculptures are these K&S precision brass wires. And the reason that I like these is that I can solder them together to make sure that I have a really good union between the different joints, and also because they do something called sleeving. Now, what a sleeve is when one of the wires is slightly larger than the other wire, and I can put them together and they fit without having a lot of movement in between them. They sleeve together really nicely. This is ideal when I'm creating shoulder joints and I want to have the arm removable so that I can sculpt the arm, and then I need to be able to put it back inside the sculpture. This character here, Uguay, has that with his arm. I actually used a square tube for the armature inside here, and he's got a slightly larger square tube on his shoulder so that I can put the pieces back together and they will sleeve really nicely and hold it in place. The square tube allows it so that it doesn't rotate around in its socket. It will keep it right where I want it to be. Now, on larger sculptures like Mr. Wildred here, you want to use something that's a little bit thicker, or if I'm not 100% sure what I want the pose to be and I want to have some leeway with it, brass isn't going to be the way to go because it's too rigid. For that, you're going to want to use something like aluminum armature wire. You can get this online or at any art store. The thing is about aluminum though is it's very soft, it's very malleable, and so it's not going to be ideal for holding itself upright, so you need to do a twist in it. A lot like this, or as you can see here with these 4 wires. It's a lot like how they handle rope. The individual fibers of rope are not strong enough to support it, but when you twist enough of them together, they become really, really strong and can hold the weight of it. Now, this is 4 pieces of wire bent together. You typically don't need to do that. 2 will be enough. Now I've got 2 different gauges of wire here for the arms and for the torso and the legs. And the thicker the gauge, the more rigid it's going to be able to hold itself up. Now to get these twists, you're going to either do it manually or you can use a drill to kind of hold the wire together and then hold the other 2 ends with a pair of pliers and just kind of twist it until they bond together like this. And that creates a nice little rigid armature for you. Now you can take this and you can pose it into any pose that you would like it to have. But if you're like me, I want to make sure that the bone structure that's inside of here doesn't bend, because that would be really bad if your lower leg bent in half. That just means that you broke your leg. So I use, in conjunction with an aluminum armature, I'll use something like this, JB Weld Steel Stick. This is a 2-part epoxy that you blend together much like a clay that you can then wrap around the armature, and then after 5 minutes it becomes rigid. This actually has steel powder inside of it, so it becomes super rigid and is safe to use with polymer clays. What I'll do for that is I will create sections that are the bone that I don't want to have bend, but then I'll leave a wide enough gap in here so that even when I've got some clay on there, I can still reposition the figure and not worry about the bone structure actually bending where I don't want it to be. So when I'm building pieces like this, I'll typically do a little bit on the chest, a little bit in the hips, and then both the leg bones as well as both of the arm bones, so that I can create nice strong bends or bones in there so that I can bend it freely whenever I start to sculpt it later on. So there you go. Really simple, easy approach to armature wires, but that'll help to allow you to make things that have a little bit more posability and a little bit larger sculptures that can sustain themselves when in the baking process. So hopefully that gives you enough information to get you going into your venture with polymer clay. It's a fun world and you can't get enough of it. Once you start, you'll just keep going and adding and adding. If you've got any tips that you think I've missed, please add those to the comments below. I love to learn from all of you, as well as you learning from me. So remember to work smarter, not harder, and I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks.